The alarms were screaming before the ship even hit the ground. Keth'mir's 4 arms moved across the console with practiced precision, each limb managing a different system while his consciousness divided among them with the effortless multitasking his species had evolved for over 15,000 years. His large compound eyes, each capable of viewing a different spectrum simultaneously, tracked the cascade of failures blooming across the holographic display like a malignant flower. Solar flare, unshielded systems, cascading electromagnetic failure, impact in 73 seconds. Brace, he called to the cockpit, his voice carrying the harmonic frequencies that his species used for urgency. The sound rippled through the steel corridors of the Meridian, a merchant vessel on a routine survey mission through the Kepler outliers. Yuki Torres, strapped into the navigation console beside him, didn't brace. She was already moving, her human body shifting with the kind of intuitive fluidity that had always made Keth'mir slightly uncomfortable. Humans didn't plan their movements, they simply reacted. It was chaotic, inefficient, and yet... 40 seconds, she shouted, her fingers flying across haptic controls that Keth'mir had long since abandoned. The landing gear won't deploy. Secondary hydraulics are offline. If we hit nose first. I am aware of the mathematics, Keth'mir said not unkindly. His primary eyes remained fixed on the descent trajectory, while his secondary eyes scanned the emergency protocols. 43 years of Vren training had prepared him for exactly this scenario. The manual was clear. Emergency Protocol 12A, landing gear failure. Procedure involved attitude adjustment, velocity reduction, and activation of the crash foam throughout the cabin. He initiated the sequence. The foam erupted from every wall, a viscous, hardening compound that would absorb impact energy. The ship lurched as the attitude thrusters fired in a pattern Keth'mir's mind had calculated microseconds earlier. And then there was the sound of impact, a groaning shriek of metal, and the awful crunch of physics taking its toll on human engineering. They hit hard enough that Keth'mir felt his exoskeleton crack. Not deeply, a hairline fracture along his left shoulder joint, but it was there. Pain sang through his nervous system, a discordant note in the symphony of emergency alerts. When the dust settled and the alarms finally ceased, there was silence. Keth'mir's breathing stabilized slowly, his 3 gill slits on either side of his neck fluttering as he regulated his oxygen intake. The crash foam was already hardening, and he could feel gravity asserting itself, lighter than Earth normal, but present. That was concerning. He needed to assess the external environment immediately. Status, he asked his antennae, delicate sensory organs that had evolved to detect electromagnetic fluctuations, quivering as they scanned for energy signatures. I'm alive, Yuki said from the navigator's seat. She was pulling herself out of the foam with the kind of determined grace that suggested she'd already done a rapid self-assessment. Human, unpredictable, biological inefficiency given a pulse. And yet she was alive. Functional. Exoskeletal fracture, but non-critical. Keth'mir's secondary eyes were already analyzing the physical layout of the cockpit, identifying what could be salvaged, what was lost. He pushed himself upright, his 4 arms working in concert to extract himself from the impact foam. I'm accessing the emergency systems now. The holographic display flickered to life, battered but operational. Keth'mir's mandibles, the specialized mouthparts evolved for his species' crystalline diet, clicked in what Yuki had once identified as the Vren equivalent of a grimace. The news is poor, he said quietly. The primary hull has sustained multiple breaches. Life support is operating on secondary systems. The communications array is compromised, non-functional. Our distress beacon is still broadcasting, but the power cell is at 63% capacity. If we activate emergency protocols immediately, minimal movement, maximum power conservation, we have approximately 72 hours before secondary hull failure becomes imminent. Rescue operations could take anywhere from 30 to 90 days, depending on traffic patterns through this sector. Yuki was already pulling off her flight suit, revealing the thermal underlayer she wore. Then we'd better figure out what we're working with outside. Come on, let's assess the crash site. We will wait, Keth'mir said immediately, his antennae bristling with something between alarm and authority. We will wait until I have completed a full structural analysis. Engaging in immediate external reconnaissance violates Emergency Protocol 12A subsection 7. Exposure to unknown environments wastes thermal energy, creates unnecessary risk, and means we might miss the water source that could keep us alive, Yuki finished, moving toward the emergency hatch. Keth'mir, I've been on survey missions for 12 years. My gut is telling me this moon has liquid water. If I can locate it in the next few hours, while we still have sufficient daylight, and before whatever's out there figures out we're here, then we go from possibly die in 72 hours to possibly die with a reliable water source. Keth'mir's skin flushed blue-green, a color that indicated frustration mixed with reluctant acknowledgement. The human was not technically wrong. Water was, indeed, the primary survival factor in any extended stay beyond rescue parameters. But she was approaching it all wrong. If you insist on this foolish endeavor, he said slowly, each word carefully enunciated, then you will follow a specific pattern. Northernmost approach, 3-kilometer radius, return within 4 hours, maintain constant communication via the secondary comlink. And you will wear the emergency suit with full thermal regulation. The external temperature appears to be 14 degrees Celsius. Your species requires constant temperature stability, and thermal suit is already on, Yuki said, sealing the garment with quick, practiced motions. Secondary comlink is in my pocket, and I'll make it back before the primary light source dips below the horizon. Trust me. Trust, Keth'mir said, his compound eyes tracking her as she activated the emergency hatch mechanism, is a concept the Vren abandoned approximately 14,000 years ago in favor of evidence-based decision-making. Yuki grinned, that infuriating human expression that somehow conveyed both humor and determination simultaneously. Good thing I'm not Vren, then. Catch you in 4 hours, Scales. She was gone before he could formulate an appropriate response. Keth'mir did not trust. He calculated. With Yuki gone, he turned his full attention to the ship, moving through the corridors with methodical precision. His forearms proved invaluable, one manipulating the environmental systems, another scrolling through the structural integrity readouts, a third documenting damage in the ship's log, and the fourth simply steadying him against the listing bulkheads. The Meridian was worse off than he'd initially assessed. The primary power cell had sustained electromagnetic damage and was operating at 41% capacity. The auxiliary systems were generating heat inefficiently. The water recycling plant was offline. The food storage was intact, but he needed to conduct a full inventory and develop a rationing schedule immediately. By his calculations, they had approximately 63 days of food if he implemented a strict regimen, 1,200 calories per day for himself, 2,000 for Yuki. Humans had inefficient metabolisms. That assumed they made no further mistakes. That assumed rescue came on schedule. That assumed nothing else went wrong. Keth'mir pulled up the emergency protocols on his personal data pad, a crystalline tablet that responded to his touch with the ease of 15,000 years of evolutionary refinement. Protocol 73, minimal movement, maximal rationing. It was beautiful in its simplicity, detailed, comprehensive, written by species who understood that survival was not about hope or intuition. It was about mathematics. He began organizing the food stores at 1947 hours, ship time. By 22:34 hours, Yuki had not returned. Keth'mir's antennae were vibrating at frequencies that the human couldn't hear, a discordant note of electromagnetic agitation that indicated something approaching what his species might call anxiety. She was overdue by 2:34. The primary light source had dipped below the horizon at approximately 22:17 hours, local time. She was now moving through the planetary surface in darkness without adequate illumination protocols or backup systems. This was inefficient. This was dangerous. This was exactly what he had predicted would happen when she insisted on disregarding proper procedure. At 23:09 hours, he saw movement outside the view screen. His compound eyes magnified automatically, analyzing the thermal signature. It was humanoid, moving with deliberate purpose toward the ship's emergency hatch. Yuki, gasping, covered in a rust-colored substance that might have been soil. And she was that smiling? "Before you begin," she said, pulling off her thermal suit hood as the hatch sealed behind her, "I know I'm late. I know it's dark. I know you're about to give me a 12-minute lecture on resource expenditure and risk assessment." "The lecture would require 9 minutes," Keth'mir said coldly, though his antennae had returned to their normal frequency. "Not 12. Even better. Let me talk first." Yuki was pulling something from her suit, fabric, from the looks of it, strips of material tied together into what appeared to be a carrying device. And it was heavy. "I found a geothermal spring. Active. Stable temperature of approximately 41 degrees Celsius. Surrounding area has evidence of sustained water flow, which means mineral deposits, which means..." Which means nothing if you've contaminated yourself with unidentified substances, Keth'mir interrupted. Decontamination is protocol. Medical scanner first. Detailed report second. Everything else third. But even as he said it, his eyes were widening. Because Yuki was opening the carrying device, and what tumbled out onto the floor of the Meridian's cargo hold was food. Real food. Living food, in some cases, tubers with thin, papery skin. Vegetables that resembled earth carrots, but were distinctly other, with subtle color variations and leaf structures that suggested alien growth patterns. Something dark and leafy that his databanks identified as a form of chlorophyll-based plant matter. And underneath it all, an aroma that his antennae were already analyzing, water-rich, nutrient-dense, potentially edible. How was all Keth'mir could manage. Someone planted a garden, Yuki said, her voice carrying a note of wonder that made her sound younger, more vulnerable than he was accustomed to hearing. About 2 kilometers north-northwest of the crash site, in a basin above the geothermal spring. The plants have maintained themselves, they're hardy, adapted to this environment, and based on the root structures I examined, I'd estimate they've been here for at least 30 years. Keth'mir's mandibles opened and closed without producing sound. This suggested intelligence. Previous habitation. A failed colony, perhaps, or a research outpost. And more importantly, it suggested that Yuki's chaotic, unpredictable approach to survival had yielded results that his careful calculations had not. There's more, Yuki continued, pulling out a small container. Inside, crystals caught the light, salt. Actual salt, harvested from mineral deposits near the spring. I found a basin that someone had constructed decades ago. Same design I remember my family using after the hurricane. Water evaporates, salt crystallizes, you scrape it up. Still works. She set down several bottles next. Fermented material, is instruments registered immediately. Vegetative matter preserved through anaerobic fermentation. The bacteria cultures appear to be stable, the pH levels balanced. It would extend their food supplies indefinitely, assuming Yuki hadn't contaminated them with unknown pathogens. You were gone for 422, he said quietly. You violated safety protocol. You endangered yourself. You wasted thermal energy, and I came back alive, Yuki said, sitting heavily on one of the storage containers. With food, with salt, with evidence that we can survive here longer than 72 hours. You're welcome, by the way. Keth'mir stared at the supplies, then at Yuki, then back at the supplies. His 4 arms hung at his sides and used. His mind, usually so efficient at calculating probabilities and weighing options, felt oddly blank. How did you know? He finally asked. How did you know to look for those specific resources in that specific location? Yuki pulled off her thermal suit completely, revealing the compression garments beneath. She was exhausted, her human body trembling slightly from the exertion. My abuela survived a hurricane when she was 17. Worst one to hit the Yucatan in 50 years. When the infrastructure failed, she had to survive with what she could find in the rubble and the jungle. She taught me that the best survival strategy isn't the one that accounts for every variable you can imagine. It's the one that knows how to work with what's actually there instead of what you expected to find. That is not a strategy, Keth'mir said. That is chaos with a fortunate outcome. Maybe, Yuki conceded, but the outcome is fortunate. And right now, fortunate is what keeps us alive. Over the next 72 hours, the partnership evolved in ways neither of them had predicted. Keth'mir approached the garden with the systematic precision of a scientist. He created a full inventory of plant species, analyzing their nutritional profiles, their growth rates, their reproductive cycles. He established a harvesting schedule that would maintain the garden's long-term viability while maximizing nutritional yield. He calculated the exact distribution of their available resources, the garden's contributions, the ship's remaining stores, the preserved goods Yuki had gathered, across the timeline until rescue. But he did something he had never done before. He asked Yuki for input. Why did you choose to preserve the leafy plants separately from the root vegetables? He inquired on the evening of the second day, his antennae quivering with genuine curiosity rather than agitation. Yuki looked up from the work she was doing, constructing additional storage containers from emergency materials, with an expression of surprise. Because they spoil at different rates. The roots keep longer if they're kept cool and dry. The leaves need moisture, but too much oxygen causes decay. I'm using different fermentation processes for each. That is logical, Keth'mir admitted. I had calculated a centralized preservation approach. Your method is superior. See. Yuki grinned. We're learning things about each other. Over those 72 hours, they also discovered something else. The abandoned garden told stories. The tools scattered around the basin were primitive but intelligent. Flat stones selected for their properties, wooden implements that had degraded over decades, evidence of water management systems that suggested genuine horticultural knowledge. And in a small stone structure near the spring, Yuki found something that made Keth'mir's scientific mind ache with questions: a journal. Waterlogged, barely legible, written in a language neither of them immediately recognized. But with enough time and database searching, Keth'mir was able to identify it. It was Old Earth English from approximately 73 years prior. The entries were fragmentary, dated inconsistently, but they told a story. Day 43. The hydroponics failed. Could never get the nutrient profile correct. But the garden in the basin is thriving. The natural soil here is richer than we thought. Maybe we don't need technology. Maybe we just need patience. Day 127. The rescue ship never came. Command stopped responding to broadcasts at day 91. We've stopped waiting for them. Day 203. This world is beautiful if you stop demanding it be Earth. Yuki sat in the stone structure, holding the brittle pages carefully, tears streaking her face. They were abandoned here, she whispered. Like us. Except they had to stay. Keth'mir, standing at the entrance to the structure, felt something unfamiliar in his neural pathways. Empathy, perhaps. Or recognition that his carefully calculated approach to survival was insufficient to encompass human experience. These people, these stranded humans, had faced the exact situation he and Yuki faced. And instead of following protocols, they had adapted. They had planted a garden. They had learned to see this world not as a hostile environment, but as something that could sustain them. The final entry is dated day 417, Keth'mir said quietly, consulting his datapad translation. It says, saw ship pass overhead today. Didn't signal it. We're home here now. They chose to stay, Yuki said. They adapted, Keth'mir said. And in doing so, they created the conditions for us to survive as well. On the fourth day, the secondary power cell failed. Not gradually. Not with warnings. It simply ceased operating, and the secondary systems that depended on it spiraled into dormancy. The backup communications array, the one that had been maintaining their distress signal, went silent. Keth'mir discovered this at 7:34 ship time, while conducting his morning systems diagnostic. His entire exoskeleton went rigid, a physiological response that meant his species had encountered a survival factor they could not calculate away. The beacon, Yuki said when he informed her. Not a question. A statement of understanding. The beacon is no longer broadcasting, Keth'mir confirmed. Our distress signal ceased transmission at approximately 4:17 this morning. I did not notice due to the silent failure. There was no alert. The system simply stopped. How long until rescue realizes something's wrong? Yuki was already moving, her mind apparently working through contingencies at the speed of her unpredictable human intuition. Unknown. The next scheduled check-in is not for 34 days. Our beacon was set to broadcast continuously. The absence of that broadcast might not be noticed for some time, or it might be attributed to solar interference. Yuki sat down heavily. Then she stood up. Then she began to pace. Okay. Can you repair it? Possibly, Keth'mir said, moving toward his engineering station. The power cell is irreplaceable with current resources. However, the communications array itself is intact. If I can reroute the primary power systems, I might be able to allocate sufficient energy to broadcast a low-power distress signal. But this will require shutting down life support in 3 of the 6 deck sections. Which sections? Cargo, engineering support, and hydroponics, Keth'mir said. The 3 sections not currently essential to our immediate survival. The hydroponic section, Yuki repeated. The one with the water reclamation system. Correct. They looked at each other in the harsh light of the emergency lanterns, and for the first time since the crash, Keth'mir saw fear in Yuki's human face. Real visceral fear. If you shut down the water reclamation system, she said slowly, how much water do we have? Approximately 17 liters in the reserve tanks. With rationing, that is 8.5 days if we rely purely on the ship's stores. However, with the garden. The garden is 2 kilometers away, Yuki said. We have to make supply runs during daylight hours. We'd be exposing ourselves to environmental risks. We'd be burning calories traveling that distance. Yes, Keth'mir said. However, the geothermal spring provides renewable water. We would not be dependent on finite resources. Yuki sat back down. So our options are shut down life support and hope the low-power beacon gets noticed in time, or trust the garden and the spring and hope we can sustain ourselves on supply runs. Those are the parameters, Keth'mir agreed. Those are both terrible options, Yuki said. Yes, Keth'mir admitted, and there was something in his tone, a kind of resigned acceptance, that suggested he'd spent the last several hours considering exactly how terrible the options were. They made the decision together. Keth'mir rerouted the primary power systems with the precision of 15,000 years of engineering knowledge. Yuki helped, her human dexterity proving useful in the tight spaces where his larger form couldn't fit. The low-power beacon came online at 12:33, broadcasting their location and status to an indifferent void. And then they prepared for a siege. The next 19 days were the most difficult and, paradoxically, the most rewarding of Keth'mir's extensive existence. With life support in 3 sections offline, the ship became something between a home and a pressure cooker. The remaining habitable sections gradually cooled to temperatures that required thermal regulation. The humid air from human respiration mixed with the drier atmosphere Keth'mir preferred, creating an environment that was uncomfortable for both of them. But they adapted. Keth'mir established a rigid schedule: morning environmental maintenance, midday food preparation, afternoon systems diagnostics, evening inventory review. It was the Vren way: order, structure, predictability. And Yuki repeatedly demonstrated why that structure, while necessary, was insufficient. On the 8th day, when their water reserves dropped to critical levels, it was Yuki who suggested they start brewing the fermented vegetable matter into water-based nutrient solutions. It was technically wasteful, using water to create beverages, until Keth'mir calculated that the fermentation process actually reconstituted some of the water through condensation and allowed them to extract more nutritional value from their food supplies. On the 12th day, when the ambient temperature in the habitable sections dropped dangerously low, it was Yuki who insisted on maintaining a small fire in the cargo hold, using materials from the ship that they would need to replace. Keth'mir argued against it until he realized that the heat from a fire actually reduced the thermal load on the backup heating system, extending the power reserves. On the 16th day, when Keth'mir calculated that they were facing a caloric deficit of approximately 8,000 calories over the remaining days until rescue, it was Yuki who returned from her daily supply run to the garden with something new: protein. Small animals, creatures that resembled Earth rodents but were distinctly alien, that she had managed to trap and process using nothing but snares constructed from plant fibers and intuitive understanding of animal behavior. You hunted, Keth'mir said, staring at the carcasses. I survived, Yuki corrected. There's a difference. He helped her process the meat, a task a species found distasteful but necessary, and they preserve it using the salt from the mineral deposits and a smoking process that Yuki had apparently learned from documentaries about ancient Earth survival methods. By the 19th day, their caloric deficit had transformed into what appeared to be a sustainable, if austere, food supply. On the evening of the 19th day, they sat together on the observation deck, the one section of the ship that still had power and heating. The stars wheeled overhead, unfamiliar constellations that suggested they were very far from anything resembling home. I owe you an apology, Keth'mir said, his antennae moving in slow, thoughtful patterns. My initial assessment of your capabilities was flawed. Your approaches violated optimal protocol, yet they yielded superior outcomes. Yuki laughed, a sound that had become familiar over the past 19 days, but which still carried the capacity to surprise him. I owe you one too. 3 days ago, I was convinced I was going to die of hypothermia because I didn't account for the thermal losses in the habitable sections. You calculated that problem before it became critical. You saved my life. We saved each other's life, Keth'mir said carefully. Multiple times. I believe the human term is reconsidering my approach to survival. Reconsidering is good, Yuki said. Adaptation is better. Keth'mir was silent for a long moment, his compound eyes tracking the movement of the unfamiliar stars. When the rescue ship arrives, he said finally, I will file a report. It will detail the crash, the resource limitations, the solutions we implemented to survive. Okay, Yuki said carefully. That sounds like normal procedure. The report will also note, Keth'mir continued, that survival, when operating within optimal parameters, requires not merely calculation but also intuition. That the Vren approach, while logically sound, benefits from integration with methods that prioritize adaptation over prediction. Yuki turned to look at him, Really look at him. Her human eyes studying his exoskeleton, his antennae, his mandibles. That's the most elaborate way I've ever heard someone say, "I learned something from you." "Yes," Keth'mir said. "I believe it is." The rescue ship arrived on the morning of day 34. Keth'mir detected the approach through the low-power beacon's response protocols, a coded signal that indicated a Vren vessel moving through the outer system. His antennae began vibrating at a frequency that suggested something between excitement and anxiety. Rescue, safety, return to structured, predictable civilization, and something that felt unexpectedly like loss. Yuki stood beside him in the communications array, watching the readouts scroll across the holographic display. "They're responding to the beacon," she confirmed. "Calculating approach vector. We're going to be fine, Keth'mir. We're going to get off this moon." "Yes," Keth'mir said. "We will." Neither of them moved. The rescue operation took 7.3 hours. The approaching vessel, the Vren Accord, a Vren deep space salvage ship, deployed a shuttle with remarkable efficiency. The crew that arrived was Vren, 4 of them moving with the practiced precision of species that had conducted rescue operations in 17 different star systems. And they were absolutely stunned by what they found. "You kept the ship salvageable," the lead rescue operative, a female Vren named Keth'mir, said, her antennae practically humming with approval. "You implemented Protocol 73 and maintained secondary systems integrity. This is exemplary, Keth'mir." Exemplary. What she didn't say, but what Keth'mir heard clearly, was, "You survived using proper procedure. You did not fall prey to human chaos." And then Yuki stepped forward, and Keth'mir's antennae went nearly rigid with something that might have been alarm. "This is Yuki Torres," Keth'mir said. "My colleague. Without her contributions, we would not have survived beyond day 4. He proceeded to detail everything: the garden, the water source, the preserved foods, the protein acquisition, the temperature management, the fermentation processes. He explained with meticulous precision why Yuki's intuitive approach to survival, while apparently chaotic, had been essential to their continued existence. Keth'mir's antennae gradually lowered to a neutral position. "You are crediting this human with tactical survival capability." "I am crediting her with doing what I could not," Keth'mir said. "She recognized patterns I did not predict. She implemented solutions I would not have calculated. The Vren approach to survival is sound, but it is not sufficient when facing genuinely novel circumstances. She was sufficient. Therefore, her contribution was essential." There was a very long pause. Then Keth'mir did something that Keth'mir had not expected. She extended one of her 4 arms in the ancient Vren gesture of respect and acknowledgement. "Then you have both done well," she said finally. As they prepared to depart, Keth'mir and Yuki stood one final time on the observation deck, looking out at the red landscape that had been their home and their adversary. "Where do you go now?" Keth'mir asked. The question felt more significant than its simple phrasing suggested. "Back to Earth for debriefing," Yuki said. "I'm guessing they'll want to understand how we survived. After that, I don't know. Maybe back to survey work. Maybe something else." "I am being reassigned to the Vren survey program," Keth'mir said, "implementing new protocols that incorporate adaptive strategies alongside predictive analysis." "Because of us," Yuki said. "It wasn't a question." "Because of you," Keth'mir corrected. "You forced me to recognize that my way of thinking, while efficient, was insufficient. I am grateful." Yuki smiled. "You're going to write that report differently than you think you will," she said. "I can tell. You're going to go back to Vren Prime, and you're going to spend the next decade arguing with your government about integrated survival protocols. You're going to be annoying and persistent, and kind of impossible to work with." "Yes," Keth'mir said. "Probability assessment suggests you are likely correct. And I'm going to keep looking for gardens," Yuki said. "Places where people have adapted, survived, created something out of nothing. Because that's what I do. That's what humans do. We find a way." "You do indeed," Keth'mir said. His antennae moved in what had, over the past 34 days, become an approximation of a smile. "Perhaps if circumstances align, our assignments will intersect again." "Probably not," Yuki said. "The universe is big. We'll be in different places doing different things. You'll implement your new protocols, and I'll go find more gardens." "Yes," Keth'mir said sadly. "Probability suggests that scenario." But as the shuttle carried them back to the Vren Accord, and as Keth'mir watched the red landscape of that unnamed moon receding into the distance, he felt something unexpected. Not regret, exactly. The Vren didn't experience regret, it was inefficient. But perhaps something like recognition that they had created something together that neither would create alone. A partnership. A survival strategy that was neither purely logical nor purely intuitive, but something that integrated both approaches into something stronger than its components. The rescue report, filed 2 weeks later, was unprecedented in Vren bureaucratic history. It was written in formal Vren notation, mathematical in its precision, and it explicitly recommended the integration of human-style adaptive problem-solving into established Vren survival protocols. The Vren Council argued about it for 3 years, but eventually they implemented it. And somewhere in a galaxy, in the locations where humans and Vren work together on survey missions, survival rates increased by 23%. Scientists and analysts debated why. They cited improved equipment, better training, theoretical advances in environmental adaptation theory. They didn't know it was because one Vren named Keth'mir and one human named Yuki had been stranded on a moon for 34 days and had learned that the best way to survive wasn't to follow the rules or break them, but to understand which rules served survival and which ones just served order. And sometimes order and survival were not the same thing at all. On Earth, in a small archive in Mexico City, a copy of the journal from the abandoned garden was displayed. The final entry, translated now into multiple languages, read, Day 417. Saw a ship pass overhead today. Didn't signal it. We're home here now. Below it, added in recent years by curators who had learned about Keth'mir and Yuki's discovery, was a notation. This was likely the garden that saved the crew of the Meridian 73 years later. Sometimes survival echoes through time. Sometimes what we leave behind becomes what rescues those who come after. Keth'mir never returned to that moon. But he spent the rest of his life, another 43 years, building systems that honored both calculation and intuition. He became one of the most respected voices in integrated survival strategy across the known galaxy. And he kept one item on his personal desk, a small container of salt, crystalline and white, collected from a geothermal spring on an unnamed moon by a human woman with an abuela who had taught her that the best survival strategy was knowing how to work with what you find instead of what you expect. Yuki went back to survey work, but something had changed in her. She began documenting the places where humans and other species had adapted, survived, created sustainable systems. She published 6 books on integrated survival methodologies. She was offered positions in government, in research, in academia. She refused them all. She wanted to be in the field. She wanted to find the gardens, literal and metaphorical, that represented what was possible when different approaches recognized each other's value. They never met again. The universe was too large, and their paths diverged into different regions of space. But they were both, in their own ways, living the result of their 34 days together. And somewhere in the background of both their careers, there was a recognition that survival, at its core, wasn't about being right. It was about being together. And sometimes in moments when neither of them was thinking about it, both Keth'mir and Yuki would look up at the stars and wonder if the other was looking back.